The sound of clinking champagne glasses and laughter filled the air as Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, stood in the middle of my yard, smiling like she owned the place. Her daughter's wedding was in full swing, and the guests were dressed to the nines, twirling under the string lights Karen had strung up without asking. The smell of grilled shrimp and expensive perfume wafted through the air, mixing with the earthy scent of the grass I'd spent all summer tending to. But Karen hadn't asked me if she could use my yard. She hadn't even told me. I found out when I woke up to the sound of a marching band practicing near my barn. By the time I stumbled outside, half asleep and in my pajamas, the yard was already transformed into a wedding wonderland. Tables with white tablecloths, a dance floor, and even a fountain, yes, a fountain, had appeared overnight. "Oh, good morning, dear," Karen had chirped, waving a mimosa in my direction like this was all perfectly normal. "We're just setting up for Jessica's big day. I hope you don't mind." Mind? Mind? I opened my mouth to protest, but Karen was already bustling away, barking orders at the caterers. I stood there, frozen, as the reality of the situation sank in. Karen, the HOA president who once fined me for having a garden gnome she deemed too tacky, had decided my yard was the perfect venue for her daughter's wedding. And she hadn't even bothered to ask. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling sound coming from the direction of the barn. I turned just in time to see the gate swing open. My cows, all 12 of them, came trotting out, their big, curious eyes fixed on the wedding party. They'd been cooped up all morning, and now, with the gate mysteriously open, they were ready to explore. The first cow, a hefty Holstein named Bessie, led the charge. She ambled straight toward the buffet table, her tail swishing lazily behind her. The guests didn't notice at first. They were too busy sipping champagne and admiring the decorations. But then, Bessie let out a loud moo, and the entire party froze. "What the?" someone shouted, pointing at Bessie as she nosed her way toward a tower of cupcakes. That's when the rest of the herd joined in. Daisy, the youngest and most mischievous of the bunch, made a beeline for the dance floor, her hooves clattering against the wooden planks. The band screeched to a halt as she plopped down right in the middle, chewing her cud like she was the guest of honor. Meanwhile, Buttercup, the most food-motivated of the group, had her head buried in the shrimp platter, her slobbery lips making quick work of the expensive appetizers. Chaos erupted. Guests screamed, tables toppled, and Karen's perfectly planned wedding descended into madness. I stood at the edge of the yard, watching it all unfold, a slow smile spreading across my face. Karen had messed with the wrong person this time. It all started 3 months ago, on a sunny Saturday morning. I was out in the yard, planting a row of sunflowers along the fence line, when Karen's golf cart came buzzing up the driveway. She had that look on her face, the one that said she was about to ruin someone's day. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the steering wheel as she parked, and her designer sunglasses slid down her nose just enough for me to see her icy glare. "Good morning, neighbor," she chirped, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I couldn't help but notice your gardening project." I wiped the dirt off my hands and stood up, squinting against the sun. "Morning, Karen." "Yeah, I thought some sunflowers would brighten up the place." She tilted her head, her lips pursed like she'd just bitten into a lemon. "Well, that's creative. But I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to remove them. They're not in compliance with the HOA guidelines." I blinked. "What are you talking about? They're just sunflowers." Karen sighed, as if explaining this to me was a huge inconvenience. "The HOA has very specific rules about landscaping. All plants must be approved by the committee, and sunflowers are not on the approved list. They're too wild. They don't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood." I stared at her, my jaw tightening. "Karen, they're flowers. They're not hurting anyone." She adjusted her sunglasses and gave me a tight smile. "Rules are rules, dear. I'll give you until the end of the week to remove them. If they're still here by then, I'll have no choice but to issue a fine." And with that, she drove off, leaving me standing there with a trowel in one hand and a sinking feeling in my stomach. This wasn't the first time Karen had targeted me. Ever since I moved in, She'd been on my case about everything. The color of my front door, the length of my grass, even the way I parked my truck. But this was a new low. I didn't remove the sunflowers. Instead, I planted more. By the end of the week, my yard was a sea of bright yellow blooms, swaying in the breeze. Karen didn't take it well. She showed up at my door with a stack of HOA violation notices and a smug smile. "I warned you," she said, handing me the papers. "Now you'll have to pay the price." I didn't argue. I just took the notices and shut the door in her face. But inside, I was seething. Karen thought she could control everything, even my yard. Well, I wasn't going to let her win. The next few weeks were a battle of wills. Karen fined me for every little thing she could think of. My garden gnome, my bird feeder, even the way I stacked my firewood. But I refused to back down. I started adding more non-compliant features to my yard. A vegetable garden, a chicken coop, and eventually the cows. The cows were the final straw. Karen showed up the day after they arrived, her face red with rage. "You can't keep livestock in a residential neighborhood," she screeched, pointing at Bessie, who was happily munching on a patch of clover. I crossed my arms and leaned against the fence. "Actually, I checked the bylaws. There's no rule against it." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Well, I'll just have to call a meeting and change the rules," she finally spat before storming off. I thought that would be the end of it. But Karen wasn't one to give up easily. She called an emergency HOA meeting and pushed through a new rule banning livestock. I fought it, of course, but Karen had the rest of the board wrapped around her finger. The rule passed, and I was given 30 days to get rid of the cows. I was furious, but I wasn't ready to give up. I hired a lawyer and filed an appeal, arguing that the new rule was unfair and targeted specifically at me. The appeal bought me some time, but it also made Karen even more determined to take me down. That's when she started planning the wedding. Karen's wedding plan didn't come to light all at once. It started with little things I didn't think much about at first. A surveyor showed up one day, walking around my property with a clipboard and a measuring tape. When I asked what he was doing, he mumbled something about property lines and event planning before scurrying off. Then, a few days later, a delivery truck pulled up and dropped off a stack of folding chairs and tables. They were left at the edge of my yard, right next to the barn. I called Karen immediately. "What's with all the chairs and tables?" I demanded. "Oh, those?" she said, her voice dripping with innocence. "They're for Jessica's wedding. We're hosting it in the neighborhood, and I thought your yard would be the perfect spot. It's so rustic." I nearly dropped the phone. "You thought what?" "Karen, you can't just decide to use my yard for a wedding without asking me," she laughed, a high-pitched, grating sound. "Oh, don't be such a spoilsport. It's just for one day. Besides, it's not like you're using the space for anything important." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my temper in check. "Karen, I'm not okay with this. You need to move the wedding somewhere else." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Karen spoke again, her voice was cold. "I'm afraid that's not possible. The invitations have already gone out and the vendors are booked. It's happening, whether you like it or not." And just like that, she hung up. I stood there, staring at my phone, my mind racing. Karen wasn't just trying to use my yard. She was trying to assert her dominance, to show me that she could do whatever she wanted. And there was nothing I could do to stop her. Well, I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I spent the next few days trying to figure out how to stop the wedding. I called the HOA, but they were no help. Karen had already convinced them that using my yard was a community event that would benefit the neighborhood. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure they'd do anything. Karen had covered all her bases, and I was running out of options. Then, the night before the wedding, I had an idea. It was late, and I was sitting on the porch, watching the cows graze in the moonlight. They were peaceful creatures, gentle and unassuming, but they had a way of making their presence known. And that's when it hit me. If Karen wanted to use my yard, she'd have to deal with the cows. I spent the rest of the night setting the stage. I moved the cows into the barn, making sure they had plenty of food and water. Then I rigged the gate with a simple pulley system so I could open it from a distance. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. All I needed was a way to let the cows out at the right moment. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the marching band. I peeked out the window and saw Karen's army of decorators and caterers swarming my yard like ants. They were setting up tables, arranging flowers, and hanging lights, all while Karen barked orders from the sidelines. I watched for a while, my heart pounding in my chest, before finally stepping outside. "Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "You need to stop this. Now." She turned to me, her smile as fake as ever. "Oh, good morning, dear. Isn't it a beautiful day for a wedding?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just take it over like this." She waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just for one day. Besides, it's not like you're doing anything with it." That was the moment I knew there was no reasoning with her. Karen wasn't going to back down, and neither was I. I gave her one last warning. "You're going to regret this," before turning and walking back to the house. I waited until the wedding was in full swing before making my move. The guests were mingling, the band was playing, and Karen was basking in the glow of her perfect day. That's when I pulled the lever, opening the gate to the barn. The cows didn't need any encouragement. They came trotting out, their big, curious eyes taking in the scene. Bessie led the way, her tail swishing lazily behind her, while Daisy and Buttercup followed close behind. The guests didn't notice at first. They were too busy sipping champagne and admiring the decorations. But then Bessie let out a loud moo, and the entire party froze. "What the?" someone shouted, pointing at Bessie as she nosed her way toward the buffet table. That's when the chaos began. The wedding guests froze, their champagne glasses halfway to their lips, as Bessie lumbered toward the buffet table. Her big wet nose snuffled at the tower of cupcakes, and before anyone could stop her, she knocked the whole thing over with a single swipe of her head. Cupcakes tumbled to the ground, frosting smearing across the white tablecloth like a modern art masterpiece. "Oh my God!" someone screamed, pointing at Daisy, who had wandered onto the dance floor. The band stopped playing mid-song, their instruments screeching to a halt, as Daisy plopped down in the middle of the floor, chewing her cud like she was the guest of honor. A few brave guests tried to shoo her away, but Daisy just stared at them with her big, innocent eyes, completely unfazed. Meanwhile, Buttercup had discovered the shrimp platter. Her slobbery lips made quick work of the expensive appetizers, and within seconds, the platter was empty. A caterer tried to pull it away, but Buttercup let out a loud moo and nudged him with her head, sending him stumbling backward into a table. Glasses and plates crashed to the ground, and the guests erupted into chaos. "What is happening?" Karen shrieked, her face turning red as she stormed toward me. "You did this! You let your cows out on purpose!" I crossed my arms and leaned against the fence, trying to hide my smile. "Me? Karen? I have no idea how the gate opened. Maybe it was the wind." "The wind!" she spat, her voice rising an octave. "Don't play dumb with me. You've been nothing but difficult since the day you moved in." I shrugged, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a simple farmer, trying to mind my own business. Maybe you should have asked before turning my yard into a wedding venue." Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might actually explode. But before she could say anything, a loud crash drew our attention back to the party. One of the cows, I think it was Daisy, had knocked over the fountain, sending water cascading across the dance floor. Guests scrambled to get out of the way, their fancy shoes slipping on the wet grass. "This is a disaster," Karen wailed, clutching her pearls. "Jessica's wedding is ruined." I couldn't help but laugh. "Well, Karen, maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to take over someone else's property." But Karen wasn't done. She turned to the nearest caterer and barked, "Do something! Get those cows out of here!" The caterer hesitated, looking from Karen to the cows and back again. How?" Karen threw her hands in the air. "I don't know, just shoo them away." The caterer took a tentative step toward Bessie, waving his arms like he was trying to scare off a pigeon. Bessie just stared at him, unimpressed, before letting out a loud moo and taking a step closer. The caterer yelped and jumped back, tripping over a chair and landing in a heap on the ground. The guests erupted into laughter, and even I couldn't hold back a chuckle. Karen, however, was not amused. She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You're going to regret this." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I doubt that. But if you want to keep fighting, I'm happy to oblige. Just remember, you started this." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, a loud moo interrupted her. We both turned to see Buttercup standing in the middle of the cake table, her face covered in frosting. The wedding cake, a towering three-tiered masterpiece, was now a lopsided mess, with hoofprints embedded in the side. Karen let out a strangled scream and stormed off, leaving me standing there with a grin on my face. The cows had done their job, and the wedding was officially a disaster. But as I watched Karen stomp away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to let things go, and I had a feeling she'd be back with a vengeance. But for now, I was going to enjoy the show. The wedding chaos didn't end with the cows. In fact, it only got worse. By the time the last guest had fled the scene, my yard looked like a tornado had swept through it. Tables were overturned, chairs were scattered, and the once pristine grass was now a muddy mess dotted with hoofprints and frosting. The cows, oblivious to the destruction they'd caused, were lounging near the barn, chewing their cud like nothing had happened. Karen, on the other hand, was anything but calm. She stood in the middle of the wreckage, her face red, and her hands trembling with rage. Jessica, the bride, was sobbing into her now ruined dress, while the groom tried to comfort her, though he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "This is your fault!" Karen screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You ruined my daughter's wedding!" I crossed my arms and leaned against the fence, trying to keep my cool. "Karen, if you hadn't decided to use my yard without asking, none of this would have happened. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to take over someone else's property." Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought she might actually lunge at me, but instead, she took a deep breath and straightened her spine, her HOA president persona snapping back into place. "You think you've won, don't you? Well, let me tell you something. This isn't over. I'm going to make sure you regret this." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really? And how do you plan to do that?" She smirked, a cold, calculating look in her eyes. "You'll see. Just wait." With that, she turned on her heel and marched away, dragging Jessica and the groom behind her. I watched them go, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. Karen wasn't the type to make empty threats, and I had a feeling she was already plotting her next move. Over the next few days, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Everyone had heard about the wedding disaster, and opinions were divided. Some people thought it was hilarious, while others, mostly Karen's loyal followers, were outraged on her behalf. Karen herself was unusually quiet, which only made me more nervous. I knew she was up to something, but I had no idea what. Then, one morning, I woke up to find a letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA, and it wasn't good news. According to the letter, I was being fined for disrupting a community event and endangering public safety. The fine was astronomical, way more than I could afford, and if I didn't pay it within 30 days, the HOA would take legal action. I stared at the letter, my hands shaking with anger. Karen had played her hand, and it was a dirty one. She knew I couldn't fight this on my own, and she was counting on me to give up. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. I spent the next few days gathering evidence, photos, videos, and witness statements from neighbors who had seen Karen's wedding take over firsthand. I even found a lawyer who was willing to take my case pro bono. Together, we built a solid defense, and by the time the HOA hearing rolled around, I was ready. The hearing was packed. It seemed like the entire neighborhood had turned out to see the showdown between me and Karen. She sat on one side of the room, her arms crossed and a smug smile on her face, while I sat on the other, my lawyer by my side. The HOA board listened as Karen presented her case, painting me as a reckless troublemaker who had deliberately ruined her daughter's wedding. But when it was my turn to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid out the facts, showing how Karen had taken over my yard without permission and how the cows had simply acted on instinct. I even played a video of the wedding chaos, which drew a few laughs from the audience. By the time I was done, the room was silent. The HOA board members exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the board president cleared his throat and spoke. After reviewing the evidence, he said, "We've decided to dismiss the fine. Ms. Karen, while we understand your frustration, it's clear that you overstepped your boundaries by using your neighbor's property without consent. As for the cows, well, they're just cows." The room erupted into applause, and I couldn't help but smile. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she'd just been slapped. She stood up, her face red with anger, and stormed out of the room without a word. As the crowd dispersed, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I'd won this battle, but I knew the war wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily, and I had no doubt she'd be back with a new plan. But for now, I was going to enjoy my victory. I walked back to my yard, where the cows were grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. Bessie looked up at me and let out a soft moo, as if to say, "We did it." I smiled and patted her on the head. "Yeah, we did," I said. "But something tells me this isn't the end."